Welcome to part 2 of imaging with Photoshop layers. In the first tutorial we examined how we can create duplicate copies of our images and then work on one selectively and then blend the results together. This can be done using Photoshop's masking techniques, but for people starting out I think it's always easier just to work with a duplicate layer. It just makes everything seem a little bit more logical. In this section we'll examine how we can use the same technique but this time on colour images. On the screen at the moment is the luminance data that we worked on in the last tutorial. This is a deep image of the Eagle Nebula M16 taken with the Chile 1 telescope, and it consists of 8 10-minute exposures through the hydrogen alpha filter taken under very good seeing conditions, so the image is nice and sharp. At the same time I also shot some narrowband data, so you've seen the hydrogen alpha data already. I also shot sulfur 2 and oxygen 3, and these have been combined in the image you see on the screen at the moment. This is completely unprocessed, so at this stage there's a lot of work to be done with this, but the way I tend to work when I'm producing narrowband images, because the hydrogen alpha data is so strong usually, it's useful to use that as a luminance frame. So basically what you have is an image that's combined of hydrogen alpha data and then the tri-band narrowband data, what we call an SHO image, and that's what we see on the screen at the moment. So the idea is that you copy and paste these two together and then you blend them together, and I've covered that in earlier tutorials, so I won't cover that too much now. But the end result is to produce a two-layered image. And I'll just bring the layers menu onto the screen here, where we have the hydrogen alpha data as luminance, the SHO data as colour, and these two have been blended together. It's a vast improvement already over the original narrowband image on its own, so we can dispense with that and we'll just concentrate on this newer version. In fact, what I'm going to do is actually blend these down. I'm going to remove the layer structure for now and we'll just work on the combined image. So to do that, it's just layer, flatten the image, we lose our layer structure and we've just got what is basically a single layer image. Now what I'd like to show you in this tutorial is how we can use techniques that are similar to the last tutorial when we were working with the monochrome data, and I'll show you how we can use a duplicate layer to apply global processing effects to one of the layers and then just pick the best out of that to improve the image. So the first thing I'll do is to create a duplicate layer, and that's just done under Layer, Duplicate Layer. It brings up this little menu. I'm going to leave it just named as background copy, that's absolutely fine. So as before, what we'll see is two identical versions of the same image. One is just as a floating layer above the base image. So what can we do with this image? Well, I'll just run through a few different techniques that we can use. I won't spend too much time on this. This will obviously be done much more critically when doing it for real, but I'll just run through some different techniques we can use that will demonstrate this idea of working with Photoshop's layers. We'll start off by zooming in a little bit, because let's have a look at the most famous part of the image, which of course is the so-called pillars of creation that were showcased so dramatically by the Hubble Space Telescope in the mid-90s. At the moment it's a little bit sort of greenish, and I think it'd be nice if we could maybe just darken this a little bit to bring forward the very dramatic details that are contained within the dust, and particularly these so-called Bock globules that are very sharply defined here on the image. So one of the ways we can do that is to first of all hide the top layer and make sure the base layer is selected, and then we can apply what I've been calling a global processing run on the image. So what I'm about to do will affect the whole of the image. What I'll do for now is, because we want to actually darken this part of the nebula, I'm going to switch, as I've done so many times in the past, to Photoshop's brilliant Camera Raw filter menu, and it's just under the filter menu up here. You can see Camera Raw filter, and as I've covered this before in other tutorials, it's like a little sub-program within Photoshop, but it has some incredibly useful tools that we can use. This might look slightly different, incidentally, to the earlier tutorials that I've shown, because Photoshop has recently had a major upgrade and it has changed the look of the Camera Raw menu a small amount, but it doesn't affect most of the tools. So what I'm going to do for now is just take the shadows slider just right the way down. I'm also going to take the exposure slider just down a tad and then click OK. Now you should be able to see that that's just darkened the image ever so slightly. If we come back to our top layer, and if I just turn it on and off, you can see it's just darkened it a little bit, but it's done that to the whole image. So really what we're only interested in doing at the moment is just darkening these areas around here. So the way we do that is just pick up the erase tool from Photoshop's toolbox, and we can bring it over onto the eagle, because we'll use the brush tool to just gently manipulate these parts of the image in very small increments to help bring out a little bit more sort of contrast to the image. So the idea is you have to make sure that you use the brush size which is appropriate for the processing that you're doing. And because we're just working on this part of the nebula, I'm using a fairly small brush size, so we stay within these sort of contours of the nebula. And then once we start to erase the top image, we'll see through to the processed image below. And again, this will be very subtle, but I'm just darkening this a small amount to give it that kind of slight boost in contrast. That's it. I recommend that when you're using this tool, you monitor the opacity sliding up here. And what I tend to do, I find what gives best results is to actually use a value of around about sort of 40, though it will depend on the image that you're working on. Don't be tempted to use it on the full 100%, that can be a little bit dramatic. It's much better to kind of just work in small increments, as is so often the case with image processing. Just work with small increments to help blend the effect up to a certain level. So we can just continue down here. I'm just really darkening these dramatic bits just along here. In fact, we can zoom right in and just do a very, very minor adjustment on these incredible Bok globules, just to help bring them into prominence. I'm going to do the same here, something like this. Very, very small increments to just help give it a bit more prominence. Yeah, something like that's probably okay. And then we can do a comparison to show the previous state, and I'll just do that off screen using Photoshop's history tool. So this was where we came in, and here just darkened it a very small amount. Again, it's just depends on the sort of images you're working on, how you actually apply that effect. Now, in principle, you could continue making other modifications and then just use the same technique as I've explained here with the eraser tool. But I think if you're a little bit unsure of the technique, or you're just starting out doing this kind of thing, it's probably better to flatten the image at this stage. So I've got a keyboard shortcut set up for that, which is Control F. I just do that, and now the image is flattened to the new state. And so what we can now do is look at another type of processing we can carry out on the image, and that will be to adjust the saturation of the nebula itself and the colours in the sky around it. Because we're starting a new technique, I recommend just doing the same thing as before. So layer, duplicate layer, and then click OK. You'll pick this up very quickly. It doesn't take long to get used to it. And this time, now that we've made minor adjustments, for example, to the nebula itself, we can make some adjustments to the actual saturation, because I think it's a little bit strong in this image at the moment. And the way we do that is to once again hide the top layer, click to select the base layer. So the adjustments that we make now will be carried out just on the base layer. And we can use Photoshop's hue, saturation and brightness tool for that. It's a simple matter to come up to Image, Adjustments, and then come down to Hue, Saturation. We can just take the saturation on the image down globally, just a small amount. Don't overdo it too much at this stage to bring that down so it looks a little bit more natural. And then we click on OK. And of course, because we're using this layered technique, we can now come back to our top layer, and if, for example, we'd be doing this if we decided that maybe the saturation in, say, the nebula itself was too strong, but we wanted to keep the sky background as it was, it just gives you a way of working on separate parts of the image kind of simultaneously. This is the original image, quite subtle, you have to look carefully to see that, but I've just taken the saturation down. But if, for example, we decided we thought that was too much, it's a relatively simple matter to, as before, just click on the eraser tool, choose an appropriate brush size, and then you can, for example, paint the image to a different state. So if I come down to the nebulosity here, run the eraser tool, I'm still working with a value of about 41%, anything like that is fine. Erasing these sort of stronger parts of the nebula, a little bit over saturated. You can just work like that. And if you look here on the little graphic showing the top layer, this is an indication of where you're actually erasing the image, so you're effectively seeing through these parts to the base image, which has the slightly lower saturation. So again, it does give you very fine control over working on separate parts of the image. You can call this non-linear processing, and it works very well. So that's just a quick tweak on the colour of the image, or the saturation. So that's just a quick tweak on the colour saturation of the image by using the layer technique. So once we're happy with that, for example, we can once again just flatten the image. I'll use the keyboard shortcut, and then we can look at some other techniques. The next technique that we can look at involves sharpening certain parts of the image. And I think I mentioned in the previous tutorial, or if not in other tutorials, that when it comes to sharpening an image, it's probably not good to sharpen the whole image, because there will be certain parts of the image, if the exposures have been fairly short, where there will be a lot of background noise. So by applying a sharpening routine to the whole image, those areas will be sharpened as well. The image doesn't really need that. What is best done is to actually just concentrate on sharpening particular parts of the image. What we'll do, we'll create a duplicate layer, exactly the same as before. Hide the top layer, select the base layer, and this time we'll apply some sharpening to the image and just try and bring out some of these features in the nebulosity. A good tool for that, as I've mentioned previously, is the clarity tool in Photoshop, and that is found once again in the camera raw filter menu. So we'll call that up. And once again, we've got all our sliders on the right hand side here. We'll just zoom in a little bit so we can see what we're doing. And I'm going to use the clarity slider down here. This is a very useful tool because it provides edge contrast and sharpening, but it does a very good job of sharpening the image without increasing the noise too much. So we'll just give this a little tweak for now. And what we're looking at is things like up here. If I back this off, you'll see how that's affecting the image. It's actually doing a very good job, as I expected. So we'll take that up quite high just for demonstration purposes, and then click OK. So what we've got here is the background layer that's had the clarity filter applied. If I select the top layer, this was the previous state. So just by showing and hiding, you can see how these areas, the dark areas of the nebulosity, are really popping into view, which is great. That's exactly what we wanted to do. But what we don't want to do is, for example, to sharpen areas like down here, because this is where the noise is lurking. So what we'll do, we'll use this layering technique once again just to work on select parts of the image, like here for example. So we can start off, I'll zoom in, and once again we select the eraser tool, we match the brush to the object that we're interested in this case the Eagle Nebula itself, and I'll gently erase that top layer. It's very subtle as always, to carefully bring out some of these other parts of the nebula. You can come up to this piece of nebulosity up here, and certainly up here, although this is a little bit noisier, particularly in the dark shadow regions. Down here we've got these incredible dark pieces of nebulosity, so we can just run this eraser tool over those, and And that's probably all we'll need to do. Exactly as before, we can just flatten the image, and we've now got to this state here. Off screen I can show you the previous version when we first opened the image, and well, you know, there's quite a few differences now starting to appear. We can see much more drama in the Eagle Nebula itself, but we've also started to bring all these things out. We've adjusted the saturation, so we're going in the right direction for sure. As always, during these occasionally complex processing streams, it's always good to have a reality check where I call up the levels menu. I just used a keyboard shortcut there, but you can access it under image adjustments. And we're just checking the histogram here to make sure we don't have clipped data. And this is kind of alright for the moment, don't need to worry too much about that. And then just to finish off the image, we won't have the need to use the layers technique I've been demonstrating here, but we can just do a minor adjustment to the image to help improve the colour balance. And I'm going to use Photoshop's selective colour menu. And as I've covered in previous tutorials, we just work through these sliders to try and get a nice colour palette that really does justice to the image. It's a simple matter of just working through these individually and then just having a little play with these sliders. It's a very subjective thing. These are false colour images, so you're absolutely free to use whatever colour palette you like. But the good thing is about the Hubble palette that we're using here is that it does show the different effects going on in the nebula very well. So for example, the Oxygen 3's picked up the fainter, this bluish sort of nebulosity, whereas the hydrogen alpha filter and the S2 filter will certainly be picking up all the dramatic nebulosity here. So we can have great fun modifying these sliders slightly to give us a nice colour, a nice balanced colour view of this lovely target, the Eagle Nebula. So pretty much there. I'm not going to do too much more to that. And then just click on OK. And that's it, the image is finished. So I've just ran through several different techniques. You don't have to use any of those if you don't wish to, but the idea I'd like you to take away from this is the fact that by working with duplicate layers, you can mix and match to your heart's desire to get the best result, and it's also good fun to do as well. Okay, see you in the next one.